morning, or whatever time it is when you're watching this later. Hi, I'm Rich Fulcher. I lead the material design team. We're the team responsible for the design, the engineering, and communication of the material design system, and all the tooling that goes along with it, both for Google product teams and for developers around the world making use of material.
And I'm Elizabeth Churchill. I head up research for material design and for Flutter.
And we are very pleased to be here today, welcoming Professor Jonathan Lazar. Accessibility is a critical concern for us. As a central team that provides components to a number of different product teams, we have the opportunity to really address issues of accessibility at scale. So through partnership with Google's own internal central accessibility team, the partner product teams that we work with, and others across the company, we really aspire to serve all of our users' needs. And as Elizabeth's team puts accessibility and diversity at the forefront when they are planning studies.
Thanks, Rich. Now I'm going to just give a few housekeeping notes before I introduce Jonathan. Firstly, I will take Q&A after Jonathan's talk. And for those of you on the live stream, there is a Dory link. Please check the calendar invite, and we will be checking the Dory questions later. And Rich and I will be fielding those later.
Yes.
All right. So now it is our great pleasure to introduce Jonathan Lazar. Jonathan is a long-term friend of mine and colleague in the human-computer interaction community. And his bio, as you will see from the calendar invite, is amazing. So I'll just give you a few highlights before we hand over to him. So Dr. Jonathan Lazar is a professor in the Department of Computer Science and Information Sciences at Towson University. He founded the Universal Usability Laboratory at Towson and served as director from 2003 to 2014. Dr. Lazar is involved in teaching and research on ICT accessibility for people with disabilities. He teaches user-centered design methods, assistive technology, and law and public policy related to accessibility and HCI, human-computer interaction. He has authored or edited 12 books, a number of them addressing issues of digital accessibility, human rights, and information technology and universal usability. He has published over 140 refereed articles in journals, conference proceedings, and has been granted 2 US patents for his work on accessible, web-based security features for blind users. Dr. Lazar frequently serves as an advisor to government agencies and regularly provides testimony at federal and state levels. He's been involved in multiple federal regulations which cite his research publications. He has received more awards than I could possibly mention, so please take a look at that bio, and they're all very well deserved. We're so honored to have him at Google here today, and thank you, Jonathan, so much for joining us. Please, over to you.
Great. Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Great. It's really exciting to be here and talk about accessibility. You know, Elizabeth has been telling me about the great work of her team and the other teams at Google, and how you're really looking to expand your work in accessibility and find new collaborators and new approaches. And certainly I've seen already the results of some of that with the increased focus on accessibility at Google. So I'm really excited to be here and chat with all of you and find new ways to collaborate and connect. Just a quick thing about my background. I've been at Towson for 18 years as a professor. And again, my area of expertise is accessibility. Here's a great image here. There's an exhibit at the Cooper Hewitt Museum of Design in New York City, all about design and accessibility. And so I loved that exhibit. And also many people, especially graduate students and researchers, know me from the Research Methods in Human-Computer Interaction textbook. And I'm the lead author on that. My overall topic today that I'm going to discuss is the idea that we've actually been very successful in creating solutions for accessibility. We have technical solutions. We have approaches. We know how to solve things already. But very often we have trouble getting them implemented. So we know how to solve things, but we can't get people to use our existing solutions. This point was really brought home to me earlier this year when I was at the Maryland House of Delegates. And I was testifying in favor of a bill that relates to technology accessibility. So the bill in the Maryland State Legislature was all about putting requirements into state procurement, that when the state of Maryland procures accessible technology, when it procures technology, that technology is accessible. And it also put in financial penalties for vendors if they refuse to make technologies accessible. And I'm testifying on behalf of this bill, and I said, it's both a civil rights bill and a cost savings bill for the state. It's really a great bill. And the vice chair of the committee interrupted me with a great question. And so it was Eric Bromwell, and he said, so Dr. Lazar, we're still working on making websites work for people with disabilities? Isn't that old technology? Haven't we already fixed websites? Haven't you testified to this committee many times before about this topic, and we still haven't fixed it yet? Right, so I sheepishly said, no, the state has not fixed it yet. There's still many problems. And yes, I have been testifying on behalf of this to your committee for almost a decade. And he really brought home this point to me about how we have all these technical solutions to things that really seem almost old technology, right? We know how to solve this, but yet we have trouble getting people to implement the solutions. We have trouble getting developers, content managers to implement the solutions. And if you think about it, we have a wealth of solutions already. We have technical guidelines. Most people would be familiar already with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. And I see for many of you in the room here in San Francisco, I see many of you nodding your head, right? And a new version came out a few weeks ago, version 2.1. But that's not the only set of well-established, internationally accepted guidelines. We also have guidelines for user agents and for development tools. So we have all these technical guidelines which are well vetted by the community. We have user-centered design processes. So we know how to involve users in the development process, how to iterate, how to prototype. Right? We have great evaluation methods like user testing, and you see an image there of a usability lab. We have expert reviews. We have automated methods. So we have a wealth of resources in terms of how do we design and build for accessibility and how do we do testing. Yet, given all of these solutions, often the simplest things for accessibility are forgotten. There's still many federal government websites that don't have proper alt text. And the alt text is kind of like the bellwether, right? If a site or does not have alternative text for an image, it's probably not going to have any of the advanced features, right? It's a thing that most people who are familiar with accessibility deeply understand. Yet many company websites still don't have alt text. Many state governments, many universities, just the simplest thing that we know how to solve and it's easy, not done yet. Many smartphone apps are inaccessible, right? And they're not built with accessibility, even though they're really easy solutions for doing that, right? When you get new applications for your desktop or your laptop, often, for instance, new browser. Hey, Microsoft Edge, I'm talking about you. When Microsoft Edge came out at first, it did not work with assistive technology. Yet they know that there are many users of assistive technology who used Internet Explorer, right? Updates, not only when you have something new, but just updates. So the most recent update to Firefox, right? That had trouble with accessibility as well. And so if on a daily basis, you're an individual with a disability, you're using an operating system, an application, and suddenly it becomes inaccessible due to an update, what do? This happens often. What do? You were very productive at work and suddenly you have to stop. And people say, well, why can't you do this? Right? And there's usually a judgment, even though it relates to the developers not keeping accessibility in mind. Now, many of you know there are a lot of legal battles right now going on related to accessibility, right? Related to the accessibility of operating systems and browsers and even websites. And if you look at the lawsuits related to technology accessibility, they're usually not having discussions about technical topics, right? The legal battles are over things like the primary jurisdiction doctrine and due process, or my favorite, Chevron deference, right? I see a few people laughing like, what is that, right? And so all of these legal battles are being fought over strictly legal topics, right? And as people who are developers and in the technology community, it's puzzling at moments, right? because they're like, but this is a legal battle about technology. There should be more in the cases about the technology. I understand that at times it is necessary to sue companies, right? Because they're recalcitrant, they're not making things accessible. And in some cases they say, we don't want people with disabilities as customers. There was one company that actually said that publicly. Yeah, there are times that you do need to sue. But on the other hand, when the legal battles are being fought over issues like the nexus between a website and a physical store and how close that relationship is, that's not really a technical topic, right? Maybe it's up to us in the technology community to improve how we roll out accessibility solutions. Maybe it's up to us to push these solutions out there and find ways to influence technology developers so that some of these cases that are fighting over legal concepts, maybe they shouldn't get to court. There are times will be necessary to sue, but maybe we can do a better job about getting the development community, getting the technology community to roll out accessibility. I say sometimes some of these lawsuits are really signs that we failed. As technologists, we have failed. If it makes it to a lawsuit, it means we haven't done a good enough job as technologists in finding ways to roll out solutions related to accessibility, because we already have the solutions. We already know how to solve many of these things. So today I'm going to present to you my 8 suggestions for how we can get accessibility implemented. What steps can we take in the technology and development and accessibility research and human-computer interaction, this broad community of people who are focused on making technology better? How do we get accessibility implemented more? How do we roll it out? So I'm going to present to you my 8 suggestions. My first suggestion is that the big technology companies, so we're talking about Google, we're talking about IBM, Microsoft, Apple, they need to spend more time, these companies, seriously getting into building assistive technology and tools for developers related to accessibility, right? Many of the screen readers, for instance, are built by, except for VoiceOver built by Apple, many of the screen readers are basically built by very small companies that have small R&D budgets and don't have the expertise to figure out interoperability, right? The developer tools, the testing tools, often they do not include accessibility in a way that would actually be helpful to developers. And so we need the big companies taking major leaps, taking it seriously. Now, there are some baby steps. You know, kudos to Microsoft. In Office 365, they've put in features for you to check for accessibility. Chrome DevTools now has also some features for testing for accessibility. And so there's some preliminary steps. Apple's worked on VoiceOver. Microsoft and Facebook have been working on using AI to improve accessibility. But usually these are features hidden away, right? These are features that you have to look hard for. They're not automatic. They're not brought out to people immediately, right? And many of the automated testing tools and developer tools are still done by small companies that don't have a lot of expertise, that have small R&D budgets, right? And we need the big companies applying their knowledge, their expertise. And as these tools are built, it's surprising how many of them often do not work for developers with disabilities. So if you have developer tools for accessibility, they shouldn't be built inaccessibly, and often they are. And so basically what you're saying then is we would only include individuals with disabilities as testers or participants, but not as developers. There's this built-in assumption that they're not going to be developers, and yet, why not? Who has more expertise? Who's used to thinking about innovation? Who's a problem solver? We'll talk about that later. But we need to make sure that our development tools, that our testing tools, are not actually stopping people from implementing accessibility. Okay, our automated accessibility testing tools are often actually the problem, not the solution. How many people in the room here, just show of hands or say aye, how many people have used some of the web accessibility testing tools that'll test your web page for accessibility? Show of hands, most of you have. And I won't say which tool this is, but you look at the results from this tool. I took a very simple web page, checked it for WCAG 2.0, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And the feedback I got is that there are 15 known problems, 6 likely problems, and 586 potential problems. Now, the moment as a content contributor, as a developer, as any technologist, the moment you hear there are 586 potential problems, what are you going to do? Are you actually going to read through them? No. Yeah, you're laughing in the room. You know you're not going to read through them, right? You're going to ignore it, or worse, you're going to say, you know, accessibility is really hard. It takes a lot of time. I don't have time to read through 586. I have so many web pages, and I thought tools were supposed to help me. The problem must be much worse than I thought. It leads to this cascading effect of really ignoring accessibility. But it's not because accessibility is hard. It's because our tools are really bad, and they very often discourage us. That's a discouragement there. 586 possible problems, you're not going to look through it. You know you're not going to. It's like having a set of interface guidelines that has 700 guidelines. Give me the heuristics. Give me the short rules of thumb. That's why I'm giving you 8 suggestions today rather than 200 of them, because you won't listen to 200. Basic human-computer interaction. So our testing tools need to be better. They need to be designed in a way that people actually will use them and will actually influence content development and technology development. So that's my first suggestion. My second suggestion is that we need to use behavioral economic approaches to make accessibility easy to do and make it hard not to do. So if you think of the opt-in versus opt-out approaches, we want to make accessibility opt-out. We want to make it where it's automatically assumed you want to do accessibility, and the features and the questions are presented to you, and you have to make a hard choice if you want to opt out. Not you have to make a hard choice if you want to opt into accessibility. Probably the best known example in behavioral econ is about organ donation, right? If you're in a country where organ donation is the norm, where it's the default, where you have to choose to opt out. If you don't want to be an organ donor, you have to choose to opt out of organ donation, right? In those countries, generally, organ donation rates are at about 90%. But if organ donation is opt-in, where you specifically have to select that you want to be an organ donator, then it's usually at 10 to 15%. Because people have to go through the work of, well, I'll sign up, I'll do the paperwork, when do I do this? Maybe I don't want to do this, I'm not sure. You know, I've been meaning to do it. We need to use this example, because small changes in how we structure a decision can really influence the impact, right? A much simpler and less life-impacting example, you know, on a daily basis in many cities across the country now, there's a bag fee. If you go shopping and you want to get a shopping bag, right, they charge you 5 cents. I think San Francisco, it's 10 cents, right? 10 cents for a bag. So perfect example. This morning I went over to Walgreens. I wanted to get a bar of soap. Right? I go to Walgreens and as I'm checking out, they say, okay, do you want a bag? It's 10 cents. And I say, no, it's a bar of soap. I can put it in my pocket. But the reality is, if they automatically gave me a bag, I probably would have taken the bag. But I say, even though 10 cents is relatively small, it makes you stop and think and say, yeah, you know what? I don't need a bag. Those little tweaks, as behavioral economists call them, those nudges, can really change human behavior. So how can we use this knowledge then to influence development decisions, to influence decision making? How can we use behavioral econ to change how developers and content contributors make decisions about accessibility? So what you see on your screen now, I'm using Google Docs, right? So it's a word processing document, and there's some text in there, and I'm about to insert an image. And so as I go to insert an image, right, and I'm taking it from my computer, normally it will just insert the image. But what happens if we made a minor tweak, and instead it stopped you and said, okay, what's the alt text for this image? Minor change, right? You might get a good chunk of people then who say, oh, okay, well, let me type in the description. Done. Not that hard, not intrusive. it can change user behavior because it makes accessibility the default. You have to consciously choose to opt out of accessibility rather than consciously choose to opt in. You could imagine a number of different approaches you could take with this. If you don't include the alt text, you could then put a dialog box. Are you sure that you want to continue? You didn't include it. And it would be a way to enforce policies in some organizations, especially in the federal government. If you continuously post inaccessible content, you can lose your account privileges. This would be a great time to remind people of that. Hey, are you sure you want to continue? You might lose your account, right? This is probably the one that for the people who kept just skipping, fine, I'll skip it. This is the one that might get their attention. You know, very few web developers use Notepad anymore, right? You're using a web developer tool, you're using a coding tool, or you're using some type of content management system. So it's not hard to add any of these dialog boxes or prompts that will stop you and say, okay, give me the header text for the table, for the first column, right? Give me a label for the form. Our state government in Maryland, a number of sites still have Form 1, Form 2, Form 3, rather than labeling what the forms are. Simple things, not technically hard. How do we change the behavior? I suggest approaches like this. And you might say, well, but no one's doing that yet. Actually, there are a number of content management systems that are doing it. This is an example from edX, the online MOOC provider. And so they're basically doing exactly what I'm suggesting. They just rolled this out recently, which is if you go to insert an image, it first stops you and asks for the alt text. Or it says, is this a decorative image only? And it gives you the opportunity to define the height and width as well. Now, if you don't type in information, it will stop you. And it'll say, wait, you haven't filled in the fields. You know, just like when you're filling out, let's say you're going shopping online, if you don't put in your phone number, if you don't put in the credit card number, it will stop you and say, oh, we can't continue this until you've inserted the right information. And notice on the bottom, it says you have to either add a description or specify that it's decorative only. Other content management systems are starting to take this approach as well. So we can do this. We can do this. It's better design. It's supporting our developers. It's a minor tweak that could change the behavior of millions of content contributors, millions of technology developers. We can do this. This is doable. This is solvable. Minor tweaks, major impact, just like organ donation or just like the bag tax. We're used to this right now, right? We're used to, as you're typing in text, if you make a spelling error, you usually get some type of red highlighting. You get some type of notification. Here I misspelled the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog, right? You get a notification that there's a spelling error. So what if we made those types of notifications the default throughout all of our technology? How about we make it so that features to support accessible content and accessible development are just as prominent as ones related to syntax errors and spelling errors and invalid markup when we're coding and using development tools? Why don't we do that? Not to tell you, that's not my personal idea. That's actually part of the authoring tool accessibility guidelines. Let me just ask, again, in the room here, how many people are familiar with the authoring tool accessibility guidelines? Show of hands or say aye, right? Maybe we have 2 or 3 hands going kind of like this, right? So it's not surprising. ATAG, the authoring tool accessibility guidelines, they're like the little known younger sibling of the web content accessibility guidelines, right? But they deserve some attention. There are a lot of great ideas in there. And that's what I mean. There are already concepts out there. There are already technology solutions. Very often we just need to get them implemented. We need to change how we're influencing people to do accessibility. So my third guideline for how we can improve accessibility is that we need to teach more about accessibility. We need to do this in K-12 education. We need to do this in post-secondary education, and that's what I'll talk about. We need to do this in lifelong continuing education. We need to make sure that we are teaching about accessibility. Now, if you look at the curriculum models out there from ACM and IEEE, The content for accessibility is usually very small, right? So in the computer science curriculum model, only 8 hours total about everything in human-computer interaction. Not accessibility, 8 hours about everything, user-centered design processes, development tools, cognitive concepts. So if accessibility is in there, maybe you get 20 minutes of it, right? And the example they give in the curriculum model for CS is about the societal impacts of inaccessible technologies. Not about how you actually code for it or build it, but here's how people will be harmed, right? The same thing is true in the elective course in the information systems curriculum model. Societal impacts of accessibility, not coding for accessibility or designing for accessibility. Only in the information technology model, the curriculum model, do they actually have about coding for accessibility or building for accessibility. And that's a problem. There's so little in the curriculum that's about accessibility. And when we talk about accessibility, we often aren't talking about how to do accessibility. We're talking about how people are harmed if a technology is inaccessible. That's really a problem. How do we expect solutions to occur if we're not teaching people how to code or design for accessibility? You know, one thing that I do in my classes, I always set up partnerships for the students to go out and meet with users with disabilities to get to know about the barriers they face, right? To get to know what problems they have, to hear a first-hand account and include those voices into the development process, but I also teach about how you code for accessibility. We need both, right? The more we can get students involved with users out there with disabilities, to bring them into development, to hear their stories, not to read it in a textbook, but to have one-on-one interactions. But again, that's not useful if we're not teaching them how you solve it. And one other big problem in curriculum is that we are teaching accessibility just as students are about to graduate. We teach it right at the end of the curriculum. Senior year, right? They're on their way out the door, they're half not paying attention, right? And they see accessibility as an add-on. Oh, I need to do this too? Oh, and then they view it as, wait, you mean I have to go back and fix what I've already done? Oh, that takes a lot of time. That's expensive. We teach, unfortunately, most universities teach accessibility as retrofitting, going back and fixing rather than including users from the beginning. We need to include accessibility injected throughout the entire curriculum, undergraduate and graduate, not just in an HCI course at the end, not just, right, as something you learn about after the fact. We need to include it in all the courses, just like we do now with security, right? You wouldn't just wait till a senior undergraduate security or a graduate level course in security. You actually have to inject it throughout all the coursework. The University of Dundee in Scotland does a great example with this. They actually put accessibility in every undergraduate course as a short module. You get to see accessibility in context, right? It's a requirement. Everyone has to learn about it. And it helps students see that you need to include it at all phases. And if you plan ahead, it's not hard. They have speakers from industry talk about the importance of accessibility, right? It's really a good model for other universities. One great project going on right now is a project called Teach Access. You can find it at teachaccess.org. Let me ask for people in the room, how many people have heard of Teach Access before? Okay, more of you should check it out, teachaccess.org. Google is one of the partners on that. And so it's a project combining industry partners and universities to provide more of this curriculum information. They have great tutorials about coding for accessibility. They're putting it in job ads. These companies are committed to doing that. They're committed to doing more accessibility work, but also about providing resources for faculty to teach about accessibility, coding examples, instructional videos, things of that nature. Another great project is Access Computing at the University of Washington. And that project has the goal of getting more students with disabilities into computing fields. Right? That's actually really important. Because as students are learning about development and technology, if they don't see any students with disabilities, and they don't have maybe any friends or family with disabilities, they may not include accessibility into what they build, right? And then, again, an important point, that stops computer scientists with disabilities from being involved in development. If you build inaccessible tools, you're stopping computer scientists from being part of the conversation, right? It reminds me of an example from the US Department of Labor, where they once asked of the US Access Board, they asked them if they could waive requirements for accessibility. They said, because at the US Department of Labor in our section, we don't have any employees with disabilities. So we should be allowed to procure technology that's inaccessible. Of course, there's a core problem with that. The moment you say we don't have employees with disabilities, so we should be able to procure technology that doesn't work for people with disabilities, you've just created a barrier to hiring individuals with disabilities in the future. And by the way, the Department of Labor was told, no, you can't do that. So it's a great project. Check it out, Access Computing, to get more students with disabilities into computing fields. My fourth suggestion is to require notification of accessibility status in app stores, because often it's about awareness. Now, think about the following. Would you purchase a shirt before you knew what size you'd be receiving? Would you order a shirt online? You know, I really like that Oxford shirt. I want to purchase it, right? And the store tells you, well, you can go ahead and purchase it, and we'll send you whatever size, right, we think you might be good with, right? We'll send you, and then, you know, right, if it works, great. If not, okay, whatever, right? Of course not. You wouldn't buy a shirt not knowing what the size is. Yet, that's what happens in app stores. If you look at the major app stores and look at the information they provide, right? It provides information on the size of the app, how many people have installed it, what operating system version is required, right? You know, user ratings. There's no information about accessibility. So if you have a disability and you use an assistive technology, you have to download the app, and in some cases purchase the app, before you know if it'll work for you. That doesn't make any sense. From a user point of view, it doesn't make any sense. But also, by not requiring information about accessibility, it never forces the developers to stop and think, wait, is it accessible? Did we put in accessibility features? Think about this. You'd never allow a hotel, right, to require that people who are in wheelchair users, book a hotel room without knowing whether or not it's an accessible room. That would just be silly. Well, we'll tell you when you get here if it's accessible or not. It just doesn't make any sense. Yet we accept this for app stores. I'm not saying that we should even require all apps in the app stores to be accessible. I'm saying we should require that there's information in the store about the accessibility features. It makes developers stop and think, is it accessible? And maybe plan ahead. How many people in the room are familiar with the VPAT, the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template? Show of hands or say aye. See a few nodding heads. So VPATs basically do that. It's a document where developers fill in what aspects of an operating system, application, or website are accessible for assistive technology users and which are not. The VPAT doesn't require that everything be accessible. It just requires transparency, that you let people know in advance. This seems like an easy fix, right? This is something, if you just require information about accessibility, it will bring accessibility to the attention of thousands of developers, and it will also let users with disabilities, consumers, make better purchasing and downloading decisions. My fifth suggestion is that we need to collect more data on accessibility, more data about which technologies are accessible and which are not, more data about the users impacted. We actually know very little about the overall impact of accessibility. We need broad data collection. One of the problems is that often when data collection is done, it's done by researchers who say, well, I'm focusing on this one population. I'm focusing on users with autism, or I'm focusing on blind users, or I'm focusing on this one niche of the disability community, right? And to be fair, it is important to really understand each user population. And anyone who says, I understand the needs of every user with disabilities is probably exaggerating and not very knowledgeable. But what that means is that often our data collection is not cross-disability. We don't know the overall impact. We only know the impact on one specific user population. How many users do we have of assistive technology? We don't know. We don't know. And it's not as simple as it first seems. Because even if you just said, well, let's take census data in the US or in other countries, and let's just measure how many people with disabilities there are, and kind of extrapolate, not so much. Because there are a lot of people who don't have disabilities who use assistive technology or use accessibility features, right? We have a lot of people who use captioning, for instance, and captioning, right, used by people in quiet places or people in noisy places where they can't turn on audio, gyms, bars, airports. It's used by search engines. Everyone benefits from captioning. Everyone benefits from accessibility features, since sometimes you're just in a certain location where your input or output approach changes whether or not you have a disability. How do we measure that benefit? We still don't know. How do we measure that benefit, right? Another great research question would be, how is accessibility prioritized in companies? How do companies and developers make decisions about accessibility? We really don't know. This would be where research would be very helpful to understand this need. Now, it seems like, okay, we need all this data. This is great. Let's just collect data automatically. We have some issues sometimes in the area of accessibility with algorithmic bias, right? This is certainly, a hot topic now about bias. One thing to understand is that often the machine learning data sets don't include data from people with disabilities. So often, anytime you have an algorithm, it may not be making decisions based on understanding the needs of people with disabilities because their data is not represented in the data set. If you look at one of the, Google recently came out with principles for AI applications. And one of them is to avoid creating or reinforcing unfair bias. And in that statement, users with disabilities are mentioned. Perfect example here is the one of self-driving cars. A self-driving car hit a woman who was in a wheelchair. Why? Because the model didn't include the idea that there might be individuals who are wheelchair users. It gets even more complex because, again, the gut instinct is, well, we have millions of users, we can collect data online. Automatic data collection is actually very problematic for users with disabilities, right? There would be ways that you can automatically sense if someone has a disability. You can look at their plugins, you can look at what assistive technologies are running, right? You can even look at their typing patterns. And sometimes the typing pattern could be a sign that they have a certain type of motor impairment. But that leads to many problems, and that's been discussed very often in the accessibility community, that if you can sense that someone has a disability without the individual sort of outing themselves as having a disability, that can lead to discrimination. If you look, one of the key parts of American disability rights laws, and in other countries as well, is that you are never forced to identify that you have a disability. It's your choice. Many people have hidden disabilities. Some of them may be, visually obvious or physically obvious, but there are a lot of them that are not always visually obvious. You can't be forced to out yourself as having a disability because often online, companies, employers, universities discriminate against people with disabilities. I've done research on that. People with disabilities are often charged higher prices. Now, this is something, again, that's been talked about very openly, very often in the disability community. And sometimes you hear someone give a counterpoint and say, well, but they agreed to use it. It's in the privacy policy. It's in the terms of service. How many times does the average user read the terms of service? Keep in mind for accessibility, very often the terms of service or the privacy policy, it's superimposed on the screen. You're required to scroll and it's inaccessible. So very often for users with disabilities, they actually do not have access to the privacy policy or the terms of service, right? So they actually are not able to make that decision because the terms themselves are inaccessible. It's important to note that different countries certainly take different approaches. Obviously, many of us are now talking about the GDPR from the European Union. Different countries, different multinational unions take different approaches related to data privacy. But so as much as we need more data, and we desperately need more data about users with disabilities and accessibility, you can't just automate this and say, well, that's done. there are a lot of pitfalls, there are a lot of things that we need to consider to do this the right way. I recently read an article that I thought described this tension very well. An article called Fairer Machine Learning in the Real World, Mitigating Discrimination Without Collecting Sensitive Data. I thought just the title described that tension well between we need much more data to feed our models, but we also don't want to collect data that will lead to discrimination or do it in a way that is not respecting the fact that it is sensitive personal data. My sixth suggestion is that we need to bring people with disabilities more into the development process. We need to have ongoing relationships, not just at the end, not just, oh, well, you know, we've built this product, at the end, we're going to do some user testing, we'll involve some users with disabilities. No, because then you get back to the problem we discussed earlier. It's an add-on at the end. It's the retrofitting approach. It actually will take more time and cost more money because you're adding it on at the end. And if you have timelines to meet and deadlines, we know that often, right, features like accessibility will be ignored if there's a deadline to roll something out. And so you need to have users with disabilities involved as design partners in all phases of development. A best practice is to have an advisory panel of employees with disabilities or customers with disabilities, right? And I'm really pleased to see that Google has a program now called Trusted Tester, which means that you have an ongoing set of users with disabilities involved in development. It's important to know, by the way, that the term trusted tester means something completely different in the federal government in the context of accessibility. So if you are ever in a federal government context and you talk about trusted tester, that means it's a group of people who are employees in the federal government who have received formal training on technical guidelines like WCAG and have passed a certification exam. So think of trusted tester in the federal government as sort of a certification exam for accessibility, where they've done formal training and they've passed an exam. But the Google Trusted Tester program is great. And when you look at organizations that are really doing a great job in accessibility, you see them always having a group of users with disabilities who are involved at all phases, who can stop the development process, right? Who give feedback on everything. When you have users involved, you learn about their real needs rather than using assumptions. And keep in mind, most disability advocacy organizations want to partner with tech companies. Technology companies are often afraid of disability advocacy groups. Realize they want to be your technology partners. They want to partner with you. When it hits a lawsuit, and I know very often in the technology community, we're not familiar with the ins and outs of law. And so we assume, oh, you know, these disability groups are out to sue us. No, they're out to make sure that your products are accessible. Lawsuits are actually usually the last step. When a company has said something like, absolutely not, we refuse to do this, we do not value your individuals as users, right? Again, there's one lawsuit where a company outright said, we don't want people with disabilities as customers. Yeah, saying that will lead to a lawsuit, right? But most advocacy organizations desperately want to partner with technology companies to make things better and get involved in the feedback loop. So always include users with disabilities through all phases of development as design partners. We have a history on that. We know how that can be done easily. My seventh suggestion is to recognize the purchasing power that you already have. If you are a government agency, if you are a technology company, if you are a large university, you have a really big supply chain. You spend a lot of money on technology procurement, right? You need to enforce technology accessibility in your supply chain, right? There are some great best practices for doing this. Microsoft and IBM have spent a lot of time trying to demand more accessibility of their technology suppliers. This recent Maryland law I was telling you about that I testified on behalf of, it requires that all technology procurement contracts for the state of Maryland include accessibility requirements. And if vendors do not make their technologies accessible even after they said that they would, they then face financial penalties for not fixing it. You know, Ohio State had this great example where they started requiring that vendors make their technologies accessible, and Ohio State did internal testing. There's one vendor where Ohio State tested it and said, sorry, your technology is not accessible. We cannot procure this. The vendor said, it is accessible. Ohio State said, look, here are our results. We tested it, right? The vendor said, we believe you're wrong. Here are all the different ways we've made it accessible. Ohio State then said, okay, put an indemnification clause in the procurement contract. If Ohio State gets sued, you as the vendor are then on the hook, right? Do you believe it's accessible that strongly? The vendor said yes, right? And now more universities are starting to do that. More universities are starting to put in, more government agencies are starting to put in requirements, including an indemnification clause. You know, if we get sued, you as a vendor are on the hook. That's how you know the vendor is gonna stay honest. And certainly the California State University system, right, long-term has been one of the best practices in this area. They did centralized procurement for technology. They made sure they tested all of the technologies internally, right, and they put it in the vendor contracts. So there are these minor tweaks, like adding requirements in procurement contracts, adding requirements in your supply chain to demand that vendors take accessibility seriously, that they've thought about it. And this is similar to some of my other suggestions. How do we get people to think more about accessibility? How do we get developers to build it into their process? How do we get companies to be more open about their accessibility? Minor tweaks. Now, my eighth and final point relates to social pressure and cultural integration. Many of the technologies that everyone enjoys today, the general public, right? Everyone uses ebooks. Well, guess what? Ebooks started out as audiobooks for the blind. Voice recognition started out as input for people with motor impairments. Captioning, of course, we know started out as technology for the deaf and hard of hearing, right? Many features that the broad public benefits from started out as assistive technologies for people with disabilities. Accessibility led to innovation. And we need to get that word out there. We need to talk about that. Accessibility is innovation. It's about solving problems. But I loved this article in Wired with the title, All Technology is Assistive. Think about it. All technology is assistive. We all use calendaring. Why? Because we don't have the ability to remember all of our appointments. It used to be that devices were sometimes seen as not something that you wanted, like something that, oh, you know, I'm worried what people think of me. So here we have an image of a cochlear implant. And people for years have, you know, not always liked the way that a cochlear implant or a hearing aid made them look. But, you know, our societal view of that has changed. How many people walk around now with Bluetooth devices in their ear with the big blue light flashing? The idea is that that perception can change. The perception of what's desirable and what's undesirable can change. And we have a role as technologists in making that happen. Eyeglasses. They're an assistive technology, right? They are. But you know, sometimes now they're also a fashion statement, right? So it's not just an assistive technology. But yet we don't often view them as an assistive technology. We just view them as someone that everyone uses. But they are. Whether it's for distance or for reading, they're assistive technologies. When I was at the airport yesterday and I was going to the kiosk and I was, you know, filling out all the questions, did you pack your own luggage, etc., right? This screen came up. And it asked if there are any assistive devices. And it says, assistive devices include but are not limited to car seats, strollers. A stroller is an assistive device. I hadn't thought about that, but that's true, it is. Maybe our luggage is an assistive device. Although I think the airline's still gonna charge me for it, right? But really it is because I can't carry all that stuff. So we need to think about assistive devices and accessibility very broadly. We need to think broadly and realize that we all use assistive devices. Accessibility impacts everyone, right? We all individuals benefit from accessible features and assistive technologies. What's interesting is over the last 30 years, there's been much more in the public media, right? Where you see in advertising campaigns, even on Sesame Street, you see characters with disabilities, right? You see Sesame Street characters in a wheelchair, Muppets who have autism. You know, that's great, but you don't often see them using assistive technologies. You don't see them using technologies. How do we change that, right? We need to spend a lot of time talking about the technologies, not just disability, but talk about the assistive technologies and what accessibility means and how it impacts on everyone's life. We need to get, how great would it be if there were Sesame Street characters who are using screen readers or voice recognition, who are talking about the technology they used, right? We need more of that because we need everyone, especially in the technology community, to understand the impact that accessibility has. So for a minute, I just want to summarize my 8 points. You can certainly see the influence of being in the human-computer interaction community. I know that you have no more than 10 points, right? So the key points, the key 8 points about how we can get accessibility implemented more using the existing knowledge, right? First of all, big tech companies need to get into developing tools and developing assistive technologies. They need to use their R&D budgets, use their great research labs to spend more time and more money focused on building better tools. We need to change the model of accessibility for developers. We need to make it an approach that uses behavioral economics, where accessibility is already built in. It will stop you and ask for the features, right? What does this alt text mean? What is this form label, right? And you put it in. We have to make accessibility opt out, where it asks you the questions and you have to try hard if you want to not put it in, rather than try hard if you want to put it in, where we have accessibility features sort of hidden away. We need to teach more about accessibility of technology at all levels of education. And when we do, we need to not only teach about the societal impacts, we also need to teach about how you actually code for it, how you build for it. We need to require that developers for their apps in app stores have to post information about whether that app is accessible or not. We need to do more data collection to better understand the usage patterns of accessibility. Who is using assistive technology and accessible features? And we also need to look at, within companies and technology development companies, how are tools used and how are decisions made about accessibility. We need to include people with disabilities from the beginning in the entire development process, not at the end, not as a last minute. They need to be design partners. Individuals with disabilities need to be design partners. Technology companies need to leverage their supply chains and put in requirements for their technology vendors about accessibility. Again, in many ways, many of these suggestions are about bringing accessibility to the forefront, making people more aware of it, making them stop and say, wait, is our technology accessible? Because if a technology is rolled out and 6 months later, there's a complaint filed by a disability advocacy group, in many ways, the battle's already lost. The technology's already been built, right? Users with disabilities have had a time gap where they don't have access to the same amount of digital content and information. So we want to make sure that people with disabilities have equal access at the same time to the same technology. And the best way to do that is to get individuals with disabilities throughout the entire development process as design partners. And my last suggestion, suggestion 8, is that we need to talk about it more openly. We need to bring it to the attention of people using social pressure and cultural integration. Get people on TV shows talking about accessibility. Get people in the news talking about the accessibility features they use. How do we make it so that accessibility then is like fashion eyeglasses or like the Bluetooth devices, where of course I use assistive technology. How else would you expect me to accomplish my tasks? I want to leave you with one final thought from one of my accessibility mentors, Dr. Richard Ladner, who recently retired from the University of Washington. He said, people with disabilities are problem solvers. They do it every day. On a daily basis, things don't work, and they look for workarounds, and they look for different approaches. They are natural problem solvers. So what we need to do is make sure that we can benefit from the expertise of individuals with disabilities. We need to make sure that our developer tools are accessible. We need to make sure that not only do we bring individuals with disabilities into development processes as users, but also as developers. We need to make sure that every tool we build is accessible. You know, I'm always surprised when I run across a development tool and they say, well, this will help you build for accessibility, but the tool itself doesn't work if you're a screen reader user. Okay, so what's the hidden message there? Individuals with disabilities, yeah, they're good as users, but we don't want them as developers? No, we need to make sure that every developer tool for accessibility is itself accessible so that individuals with disabilities can be a part of developing solutions about making the next generation of technology accessible and fully inclusive. Everyone benefits from accessibility. Even if at this point in time, you don't realize it, accessibility benefits you and will benefit you in the future. Accessibility is innovation. And so I want to challenge all of you in the room here today, all of you who are out there watching the streaming or watching on YouTube. I want to challenge you to say, how can I make our technologies more inclusive? How can I make sure that our current technology solutions are rolled out more? How can I bring this up in conversation? How can I make people more aware of accessibility, right? This is our problem to solve as a technology community, right? It's something we're capable of doing. We love innovation. We love changing and breaking things and changing the model. Well, let's do that with accessibility. Let's focus on how we can make the world of technology more inclusive for everyone. And that's my challenge to you. Go out there and make the world of technology more inclusive, take our existing knowledge, and go out there to solve all the problems that exist in the world related to technology accessibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you very, very much. So do we have any questions on the Dory?
We do.
Okay.
It might be easier just to project.
What's the easiest way to do this?
I think project, and then you can read. I can't because I had to borrow the eyeglasses earlier. Exactly. So maybe if we pop them up there, you can read and answer
Okay,
them, Jonathan.
certainly. I'll be happy to do so.
And then we can take some questions from the
Oh
room
my
as well.
gosh. Can you make that font bigger? I can't read that. Really? See, flexible fonts, where you just make a few clicks and the fonts are much larger. Built in helps everyone.
So the first question is, what are other topics in accessibility and imagery, in addition to alt text, that you think should be considered when giving designed guidelines?
Accessibility and imagery, you said.
And
Okay,
imagery.
great. Now, I often talk about alt text because it's the simplest example. It's sort of the lowest common denominator that everyone knows. But we also certainly have to consider, right, visualizations. If you have data visualizations, how do we make those accessible? We need more research on that, but a solution that already exists is one that everyone benefits from, which is post the data file, right? Open data benefits everyone. It allows any user to take the data and just do analysis in their preferred tool, right? One thing that's very good, which we actually have a number of other solutions on, for a lot of mathematical formulas, right? We already have existing markup languages. So if anyone out there is thinking, well, you know, I'll just do these mathematical formulas as an image, please don't, right? Use the proper markup languages to do that. Yeah, we need more work on visualization, but I think the key thing is, again, if you post the data sets, that allows users to analyze it and manipulate it any way that they want, and that benefits everyone.
Okay, and the next question is from somebody who's actually in the room, so I'll let him say the question.
Yeah, given the recent high-profile cases about right to refuse service, and hearing you talk about lawsuits, right? That certainly has implications for companies and their desire and ability to address accessibility issues, right?
That's really a great question. And it's actually a very complex one because the courts have almost unanimously said, the federal courts in the US have said that people with disabilities, right, have a right to use public accommodations. Now, depending on which courts, some have said it relates to the nexus between the physical location, right? The physical store and the website. It's what in law is known as a circuit split, right? Where some circuits say one thing that there is, for instance, in some circuits, they've said that even if you're a fully online service like Netflix, right, or Scribd, you still have to be accessible. In other circuits, they've actually talked about that there has to be a nexus to the physical store. So, you know, in cases like Winn-Dixie and Target, right, it's covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The website is because there's a nexus to the physical store. It's unknown yet what the impact of those court cases are related to the ability to refuse service. However, I would find it hard to believe that there would be a religious basis for refusing service. And if you look at some of those are based on religious convictions, I can't imagine that you could argue for a religious basis for refusing service to someone with a disability. I've never seen that in the legal literature, at least. Now, there is ongoing debate and about kind of what the legal requirements are, because there was a regulatory process that had started to define what the web accessibility requirements are, right, within the Americans with Disabilities Act. And what's really interesting is there was kind of a split between technology companies and companies in general, right? Technology companies, large ones, have generally signed on saying, yes, we want these regulations, right? Because we want to know what is our technical requirement. Like, we'll build the tools, we'll make it work for people, but if we don't know specifically the thresholds, it's not helpful to us. Now, other companies have asked the question that you're asking, which is, do we just have the right to refuse service to people with disabilities? And so, for instance, there are a number of representatives in the House of Representatives who recently wrote a letter saying that businesses should actually have the right to refuse service, because to require you would serve people with disabilities is a violation of companies' due process rights. Now, keep in mind, it actually says nothing about the rights of people with disabilities. They just looked at the company rights. And it's also a legally faulty argument. They cited a case but used it in a very misleading way. So I actually, related to what you're asking, I find that so much in accessibility goes through the law. And there's so much of a legal impact in ways that it doesn't impact the rest of human-computer interaction as much. Many of you know I actually took a leave of absence from my professorship last year, and I went back as a graduate student to study disability rights law. And so I completed an LLM degree at the University of Pennsylvania in law, because I was so fascinated by these topics that you were asking and trying to understand, well, how does this impact us as technologists? So it's really a great question. It's a complex one with a lot of ongoing activity, and it's important as technologists to do our best to understand the legal requirements and also to inform decision makers and policymakers who very often don't understand the technology basis of it, right? They don't understand, for instance, that the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, right, has been vetted by every population. It's been vetted by technology companies and government agencies. It's used by governments around the world. It's well documented. So we need to get our voice as technologists out there in the world of policymaking so that decisions made related to technology accessibility are based on sound science and research and development.
Thank you. You mentioned using R&D budget to do research. What is one question you would want answered around accessibility and imagery?
A great question. Well, can I actually give two? Two things I think would be great?
Absolutely.
Okay. So there's a great research project going on right now at Microsoft Research related to using image recognition, right, to try and find similar images, right, that look similar to the graphic you have that's not labeled, and come up with potential alt text based on that. Now, this is just at the beginning stages of a research project, but how great would it be then, right, to use that approach and insert that into our development tool? So if you say, like, no, I don't want to insert alt text, the next pop-up is, okay, here are 4 potential alt text descriptions that we found on the web. Are any of these accurate? That would make it easier for developers, right? So I would love to see something like that. And again, expanding it out, right? You could certainly suggest, for instance, field names, right? Very often, the way that screen reader users, if a field is not labeled properly, what will they do? They'll navigate around the form and find out what other text is nearby to try to guess at what the fields are asking for, right? well, why can't we do that for development tools as well? We can get to the point of not just stopping and requiring that you enter it, but coming up with, say, maybe some suggestions that maybe are correct, maybe are not, but that would still be really useful. And you could apply a lot of accessibility concepts that way. Form labels, table labels, right? You could basically use some AI approaches to find what you think it might be, but then require that the developer confirm it, right?
Okay, we're scrolling.
Okay.
Nudging is a clever way of organizing choices, but it can breed frustration if not done artfully. For instance, your docs example of interjecting alt text prompts when uploading images. Many docs never get shared. So maybe it would be better to ask at the moment they click share. What do you think of that?
That's an interesting question. I would actually disagree with that approach of only requesting the alt text when you do share. Because what will happen? Often you share a document when you're on a short timeline, right? When, okay, I made my changes, now I'm shipping it off to my friend, I gotta run, right? Chances are good that's the point at which you're not gonna really feel like adding things, right? And then you're gonna say, well, I'll just share it with most of the people, I'll add it later. We don't wanna make it a last minute accessibility fix where you add on, right? Keeping in mind often that time pressure is really a concern. We wanna stop people at the moment they create content, right? At the moment that they build a technology, not later on in adding it. That's still the retrofitting approach, right? Plus, at a given moment, you don't know which documents are going to be shared with others. You know, you're working on some notes for yourself, then you wind up sharing it. It's better to get people to stop and think about accessibility at every moment, right? And say, how can I make this accessible rather than a later on? You know, one of the frustrations we often have with voting machines, right? Why do people find the voting process so frustrating? Because, right, they're usually, when they vote in person, they're on the way to work, on the way back from work, running errands, trying to fit it in their lunch break, going to pick up an elder relative or a child from daycare. Right? And so what happens is that they're always in a rush, and that's why voting is so frustrating, among many other reasons, right? We don't want to insert things when we know in advance there's a time pressure, because that's likely to lead to people not implementing accessibility, or if they're doing it very poorly, like picture of mom, right? Or something very quick rather than a thoughtful answer.
Okay, so Bob's feeling pessimistic here. He's like, most likely accessibility implementation will require laws with enforcement and penalties as it has been in physical access in buildings. It seems the best alternative is to make it integral to development, reframing since context has different assistive dimensions that need affordances.
I agree that we need laws, and I agree that we need enforcement, and I agree that we need lawsuits, right? However, I don't think it's okay for us as a technology community to just say, you know, we're gonna let the legal folks do it, right? Because most lawyers don't have that much expertise in like internal development processes and building. We can come up with the best solutions, the best development tools. We can use our expertise to make it less likely that people will build inaccessible technology or content. There still definitely will be a need for lawsuits and laws and enforcements and everything else. But that's not a reason that we should abdicate our responsibility and say, we'll just leave it to the lawyers. Because maybe they can do enforcement, but enforcement will still be done in a very hard way because our tools aren't good. And people are gonna say, oh my gosh, accessibility, it's so hard, right? Well, no, it's hard because we don't build it into the process and we don't have good tools. It's not conceptually hard, right? You know, very often, people with disabilities are discriminated against. And so if you think of an online employment application, I've done some research on online employment applications. Imagine you're applying for a job, you go to the online employment application, right? It's inaccessible. And then there's some type of test online, some type of exam, some type of simulation, and the simulation of the test is inaccessible, right? So you use an alternate way to approach the employer and you say, hey, can I apply a different way? And they say, well, why? Well, I'm finding your online tools for employment really hard to use. What do you think is the likelihood that that individual will get hired? It's not very likely. They'll say, for Pete's sake, they can't even use the application to apply for the job. How are they going to do the job? They're always going to be asking for accommodations. It's going to put a lot of burden on us. But it has nothing to do with the actual skills of the individual with a disability who's applying, right? It has to do with the fact that developers chose to build barriers. Maybe they didn't realize that they made that choice, but they did. And so if we put those barriers in place, there's then that assumption of people with disabilities they have a lower skill level, right? They're not gonna be able to do the job, but it's because of barriers that we placed. It's not, for instance, if you have an inaccessible building, it's not the individual with a disability that's the problem. It's that the building was not built properly, right? And so yes, related to the last question, yes, we need to have technical standards. Yes, we need to have enforcement. We need to be very clear in letting people know what the legal requirements are, what approaches they should use, but we can't just leave it to the lawyers. They have a role to play, but many of these things we can solve as technologists, and we should solve. We can make the experience better in a way that in many ways the legal field cannot. They can do enforcement, but we can make it so that doing the right thing and doing good design is so much easier that people actually use it. Again, right? Look at that model I was talking about with the bags, how it changes people's use of shopping bags when you require 10 cents. So yes, that's a policy intervention. That's a nudge, right? That's something that's really important. But we also want to make it really easy to make the right choices and to build accessible technology and content. So yes, both sides have a role to play. I don't think in our community right now we're doing a great job, though. I think we can do much better.
It's going to come to Lisa's question in a second, but the last question that you mentioned was, would you recommend hiring more developers from the disability communities as one way to implement your point that they be more part of the development process? And I think your answer to that is yes.
Yes, my answer would certainly be yes. Yes, certainly hire more developers with disabilities, right? Not only do they have expertise, but the more other developers interact with them on a daily basis, they learn informally and they start thinking, oh, I never thought about that. You know, I'll tell you a story. When I was 9 or 10, my grandmother, right, was using a walker. And we had an issue related to accessibility in the apartment complex where she lived, right? So I was made aware of accessibility issues when I was 9 or 10 years old, right? But a lot of people don't have that experience. And the more you bring it into awareness, then it's like, oh, okay, it's just a technical problem. How do we solve this? We want to get that curiosity, that drive for problem solving, right? We want to use that for the benefit of accessibility. We want people to be aware of, oh, okay, well, how do we solve this problem? Great, let's make it work. We want people hacking away at solving problems. That's what we're good at. In technology, that's what we're good at. Let's get people focused around doing that.
And certainly Rich mentioned at the beginning, I'm really interested in accessibility, and folks on my team, Michael Gilbert is sitting here and Tao Dong is somewhere, I hope, listening. We've started to include developers and designers with accessibility issues in some of our studies of developer and designer experience as well.
Wonderful, wonderful.
So
there are some really great strides at Google. I mean, I'd love to see more, but there's some really great first steps, and I'm really pleased to see that.
And now to Elise's fantastic question. To prioritize accessibility, it is easy to make an argument for captioning that a lot of people use. It is harder for a feature that would benefit a smaller number of users. How could we replace the logic of number of users concerned by a more global logic of equity in the decision making? Oh, yes. How can we do that?
It's a great question. Great question. Oh, that's your question. Well, it's a great question. Right. Well, that's one of the arguments that I'm making, which is that we need to understand how features overall, not just one specific population, because the way the guidelines are written, they're not written as this is the guideline for people who are blind, this is the guideline for this other group. You know, and certainly there are many guidelines that cross multiple disabilities. So for instance, the accessibility features that are helpful for blind users also are helpful for people who have learning devices and have motor impairments. Right? And you also have screen reader users who have learning disabilities, right? So that's why the guidelines were always the really big focus, because they cross disability, like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They are not disability specific. They cross all the various disabilities, right? And so we do want to make those arguments, not on a disability by disability basis, but on a very broad basis. And the guidelines are really, I think, the best example of how we do that. Right? And they keep updating them and they, you know, make them better and more inclusive. But what really benefits developers a lot is that all of these guidelines are well documented and have explanations of all the different ways you could technically do this, right? And that makes it much easier as well. It not just, you should fix this and you should address these certain things, but here are your solutions and here's how you approach it. So I certainly believe so. We don't want to focus on, well, let's do things for certain user set and not for others. We want to focus on how do we make it usable for the broadest number of users using the knowledge that we already have. So you're absolutely right.
I've long argued for use experience, not user experience, as what we do, because I think those shifts in words make a huge difference, to your point, Jonathan.
Yep.
And a question from Dave. What are your thoughts on offering the same accessible interface for all users versus interfaces optimized for different users? Should UIs be weighted towards sighted users, e.g. a screen reader plus keyboard could navigate very dense UIs that would be ineligible to sighted users?
Okay, a great question.
Illegible.
Oh, yeah. Okay. As you see me staring at the screen here trying to say, what does that question say? And in fact, in many ways, this is an accessibility feature, right? I can't see what's on the screen because it's so small, so I'm counting on you to give me voice output.
And I can't really read that well without Rich's glasses.
So, right, it's a great question. And so what we want to do is not have different interfaces optimized for different users. We want to have one interface that's flexible enough for multiple users. Because what will happen is if you, let's say you have, and again, I'm not suggesting this is a good practice. You have one version that works for the general population. Then you have one version that's optimized for screen reader users. And you have one version that's optimized for this other user population. Very often what you'll have is all of those will not be kept up to date. You'll have the really important version, and you'll have these secondary and sort of tertiary versions that are not kept up to date, that don't have all the same functionality. You know, a few years ago, we did a research study on that. Anytime that a company says, well, you know, our main website or our main application is not fully accessible, just use the mobile version, right? Mobile version, that's more accessible. But the mobile version doesn't always have the same functionality. It doesn't have all the same features. You can only have 50% of the experience. And so what you want to do is not say, here's this version for this user population. You want to make one very flexible version that works well for everyone. Because keep in mind, right, at different points in time, individuals have different temporary impairments as well. If you're driving a car, right, you can't, or you shouldn't at least, be looking at the screen in your car, right? Let's say you broke your arm, right? Even if you may not have a permanent disability, you may need to have some flexibility in how you do input, right? So we all have moments that we have temporary impairments, right? Our goal is to make one version that's flexible, because not only do we have temporary impairments, but also we want to access the same applications, the same content from multiple devices, right? So, you know, I've been traveling around. Right now I'm using my MacBook, right? Sometimes I am at home or in my office where I'm using a PC, right? I might be using a Chromebook. So we are now really people who want access using different devices, different operating systems, different types of connection speeds. Flexibility benefits everyone, and that flexibility makes it better design. Accessibility is better design. It's flexible design. It's inclusive design. These are things that we know. These are things that are well documented. These are things that we are capable of doing. And so my suggestions today were really trying to find ways to implement some of these existing solutions. How can we push the needle using our knowledge in computer science?
I think that is a wonderful, wonderful place to say thank you so much. Thank you, everyone on the live stream. Thank you, everyone in the room. Thank you, Rich Fulcher, for co-hosting, lead of material design. And especially thanks to you, Jonathan. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here today.